All right, and finally, I think it's finally, no, there's two more topics. This is the second to last. I want to talk about zoos and arks. You'll sometimes hear people talk about ark conservation or zoos as arks. If you're not familiar with the story of Noah's Ark, of course, in the Bible or the Tanakh or the Quran, the idea of Noah as being this prophet in the Old Testament who hears from God that there's going to be a flood and is commanded to build an ark and puts, depending on how you interpret the word land, either all the animals in the world or all the animals in his immediate region onto a large boat. Well, like a huge boat. I don't want to downplay how gigantic the measurements are that are described in the Bible, but big ol' ark, and then survives the flood. People sometimes describe zoos as arks or wildlife sanctuary areas, or things like the Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center, which is sort of like a drive-through zoo, but with quite large enclosures, close to Gridwood. You drive by it if you're coming up from Kenai Soldotna up to Anchorage or vice versa. So anyways, that's the idea of an ark conservation is the idea that captivity can actually help conserve a species. And that gets us into the idea of in situ versus ex situ conservation. In the conservation world, we use in situ conservation to mean saving an animal in sight, making efforts to save the habitat, put up anti-poachers, whatever the case may be, regulating law, doing more regulations like Endangered Species Acts, to help to try to get the species okay in the wild. Ex situ, the idea would be doing things in captivity to save a species, such as bringing certain individuals from the population in and then doing captive breeding. The hope being that you would eventually do reintroduction into the wild. Although it's interesting to ask what that looks like. For some species, back into the wild is fairly clear cut. We have, for example, the golden lion tamarin. They have bred a whole lot of golden lion tamarin to get that species back to a more semi-viable place in the wild. They're a little like monkey-like species. And their survival rate's not been great, partly because a captive bred animal often doesn't have the right survival instincts and things, and it's not part of a naturally formed group. But over time, with enough of, to be kind of blunt about it, pumping out golden lion tamarins over and over again that have been bred at zoos and other places, they've been able to have a semi-successful conservation program of getting them back into the wild. But what about if the habitat's gone? Or what about if the habitat's highly threatened? That's a problem that happens in a lot of cases with these reintroduction programs, is we have to, the zoos then also need to purchase plots of wild land and set them aside, because the concern is that the thing that made the endangered animal endangered to begin with is still potentially happening. If deforestation is making, this is a bad example because great apes are typically hard to breed in captivity. Let me think of a better example. No, I'll stick with great apes. If you're doing orangutan breeding in captivity or something, but the rainforest in Southeast Asia is still being rapidly logged, and you get a decently large, let's say you have 50 orangutans in your zoo population, but then you don't have a really safe place to reintroduce them to, that makes it very difficult. So species reintroduction can be an amazing thing. In situ captive breeding can be an amazing and really helpful thing, and sometimes it can work really well. Other times it doesn't work very well, or a lot of times it will work, but it will take a very, very long time, and we have to be committed to it, and we're still, in many cases, very early on in the process. It's going to take years to secure enough land and do enough captive breeding that we can really make this viable. Other times it's more straightforward, but kind of weird. So you did a reading, and in the reading they talked about some of the species of partula snails from Pacific Island nation, and that they were breeding them in like quite literally like buckets and little tanks and things in the back room of a zoo, right? So when we think of captive breeding, we think like, oh, zookeepers trying to get two rhinos to get into each other so that we can have some baby rhinos going on. But instead, partula snail conservation is super simple, right? You have like a little office that's got some windows that people can look in on, and you just kind of put them in their little enclosures. I'm not trying to minimize the important work people do with snail conservation, but it's a relatively more straightforward process. and then they're relocating them, they're reintroducing them into the wild, but the wild in this case is a nature reserve that, what did they say? It's like smaller than the room, it's as small as the room I'm in, right? Maybe a little bigger, but very, very small. It'd be like the smallest nature reserve in the world. Is that saving them in the wild? Is that the wild? What do we mean by the wild? Part of the point that Iris Braverman's talked about in her work is the distinction between wild and captive, right? In situ and ex situ. Zoos are kind of blurry in a couple of ways. They have wild animals. Sometimes some zoos have really large enclosures. There was a drive-through zoo I went through in, I mean, they don't call themselves a zoo, but that's effectively what it is. The animals are caged, but the cage is, acres and acres and acres of habitat surrounded by fencing that I drove through in Texas one time. And it's fun. The giraffe will stick its head into your car as you drive through. It's all fun. You feel like you're on a safari without having to travel around the world. But is that the wild? What about the Moise Bison Range? A fenced but extremely large area for bison that are technically wild bison, although they're tracked pretty heavily and sometimes given supplemental food by wildlife rangers, wildlife managers. Is that wild? How much land until it's wild? How little human intervention before it's wild? These are complicated questions. And it brings up the broader issue that we return to again and again in this class of we really have to think about what we're calling nature and how comfortable we are with human involvement in nature, and when is human involvement okay and when isn't it? And those are complex questions, but they come up with, for example, if it's okay to put animals in zoos, right? So a lot of people have really strongly negative feelings about zoos, as you can see by these activists here. Some people go so far as to feel like bringing them into captivity for captive breeding is likely to be very not productive, as for some species it hasn't been, and if anything is just detracting from trying to save them in the wild, right? If you've got 80 of Javan rhinos and you take some of them into captivity, and then if that's not successful, which rhinos are really hard to breed, what have you done other than weaken the wild population, right? Conversely, if we brought all 80 into the zoos and were able to successfully keep them safe from poachers because they are now behind zoo walls, have we saved the rhino species? Are they saved if they're in a zoo, right? So these are complicated questions. And of course, there's also the ethical dynamics here. A lot of people do not feel ethically comfortable with zoos at all. Some people feel very strongly that animals should not be captive in zoos. Then there's another large chunk of people who are totally fine with it, and then there's another very large chunk of people who are fine with it but want zoos to have larger enclosures, which may or may not be possible for zoos depending on how much land they have. Often missing in those conversations is the fact that zoos, even if you sort of ethically hate them for putting wild animals, sometimes in pretty small enclosures, some zoos are actively promoting conservation in the wild. Some zoos use a portion of their ticket revenues, I'm not saying like the biggest portion, but a portion of their revenues, and fund conservation in various parts of the global south as well as the global north with those money. It goes to nature preserves. It goes to buying up land as nature preserves. It goes into other things, or they're doing captive breeding programs, right? And therefore they're the reason we have golden lion tamarins. Captive breeding is the reason we have black-footed ferrets still. And so zoos are a messy, controversial thing, right? Do we accept? Well, I mean, best case scenario for some people would be zoos that were much more humane and large than some zoos are. In the absence of that, is it acceptable to have an animal in an enclosure that may be too small if the tourism money that it generates is providing money for conservation in the wild? Wow, that gets really kind of ethically grim and interesting and complex. Personally, for myself, I do visit zoos, partly because I have small children. I choose to visit zoos that I've done research on and know that they are involved in the network of zoos that do good conservation work and that keep certain minimum health and hygiene and space standards for their animals. I feel comfortable for that. I think that it produces good revenue for conservation and things like that, and I think it does help people understand more about wild animals, but there are people that don't feel comfortable about that, so it's an interesting conversation to have. So that's zoos and conservation. I also wanted to talk just a little bit about the reading you did, The Benefits of the Common by Fikret Burks et al. They're getting at this idea of what types of land ownership help conserve wildlife or destroy wildlife, which gets us into the idea of the tragedy of the commons. So the tragedy of the commons, you've probably heard of it, but it's a concept developed really much earlier by an English writer who was commenting on the ways in which common enclosures were used in villages at the time in the UK for wildlife grazing. But Garrett Hardin later picked up on this in a 1968 paper called The Tragedy of the Commons. He was an environmental scholar. He passed in the early 2000s, and he argued that essentially if you have common areas that aren't regulated, they aren't owned by anybody specifically, aren't owned by a private entity, aren't owned by the government, just kind of open, that people will inevitably very often overuse them because everybody's looking out for sort of their own bottom line, right? So it helps your bottom line, as the metaphor goes, to run 10 sheep, not 8 sheep in the, grassy place right outside the village. But that's the same thing that the next sheep herder over is thinking, and that's the next thing that the next sheep herder is thinking. Everybody wants to graze as much sheep as humanly possible, the argument goes, and so inevitably they overuse the resource, overshoot the carrying capacity, and wreck the land. Now, that's not actually what happened in a lot of cases in UK grazing, but that's the conceptualization. It's one of the reasons that it shifted over into fencing off common grassy areas and making them into privately owned sheep herding and livestock areas in the UK. Surprise, surprise, that then leads to much more private property, land as private property rather than collective property, which, one could make sort of a Marxist critique of that if one were so inclined, although that's not really the type of theory I do much with, or incline much towards. So anyways, this idea, though, of tragedy of the commons then has been used by Garrett Hardin, and that paper was very, very influential. Generations of wildlife biologists and environmental professionals and environmental scientists read that, or at least heard the ideas. I certainly did, coming up through those kinds of education systems when that was the line of work I wanted to go into. And in fact, a 2004 study found that it was like one of the most widely influential papers that had ever been written, that like environmental professionals had like either read or heard about and influenced how they thought about the world, right? So people apply it to things like salmon fishing, people apply it to things like global warming, right? Everybody's gonna, sort of the air is a common resource. People aren't gonna voluntarily restrain themselves, and it's not like when the pollution is an externality, right? They don't have to directly deal with the entirety of their own air pollution. It filters out into this kind of common airspace, and everybody's sort of bottom line to drive as much as they choose when it's this common resource, whereas people might take very different care of it if, they were sort of directly polluting into like a little cube of air that they had to breathe. So it's been applied to air pollution, climate change, all sorts of different things. Grazing on public lands, the idea of tragedy of the commons, overfishing, overlogging, have been a very influential idea. The implication of the idea, of course, is sort of the implication is that, well, then land should either A, be managed by the government, or B, be put in private property hands. That if either government's managing it or private landowners, they will have a vested interest in properly caring for a land that you don't if you don't actually own it, if nobody owns it. If nobody owns it, nobody feels ownership over it. Nobody's intentionally managing it. There's no actual governance going on. And therefore, in the lack of governance, people will overuse their resources. That idea has been very influential. It has been pushed back on as well, among others by the scholar that you read about, Fikret Burks, who's a really well-known environmental scholar. He wrote a really well-known book called Sacred Ecology. He's kind of a pioneer in TEK studies. He, in the reading, as well as the other scholars that he was writing with, really push back on this idea. And they point out, it's not as simple as sort of just anybody can use or it's owned by somebody. They say, yes, there's such a thing as kind of open access lands, and yes, there's private property, and yes, there's government property, but there's kind of a fourth category that we're not talking about here, right? Which is communal property. Land or water or wildlife that's seen as a community resource and that the community manages without a government doing it for them and without putting it into individual hands. We can think of a lot of examples of that historically. And they bring up several, right? They talk about Maine lobster fishers. They talk about other things as well. I think they talk in that reading about something Fikret Burks has done a lot of research on, which is Cree, what gets translated into English as like tallymen, but historically Cree trappers, where you would have trap lines that were managed by a family, and the extended family would have like people kind of keeping track of how much was getting caught in different areas, making sure people spaced out their fur trapping operations, things like that. Sometimes didn't work, sometimes did. But for a long time prior to colonialism, that had been a really sustainable way of sort of harvesting animals for food and fur. And so communal property, right? An area as sort of this extended family owns that. Up here in Alaska, right? In Tlingit areas, you had clans as well as clans, so villages as well as clans, and clans traditionally owned certain fishing spots, right? So it wasn't an individual, it was a large extended family group that were then sort of managing that space and passing along teachings and ideas about how to properly manage it. You have the Maasai, cattle herding group in East Africa, where traditionally the elders of the village, when a young man is first starting up his cattle herd, about ready to get married and start his cattle herd, they will sort of like point out different areas and be like, okay, this is where you're going to herd, this is where you're going to herd, and they're kind of managing the whole thing, even as people get older. So it's sort of elder run rather than government run, and it seems to have worked pretty well for them prior to governments being around. And so the idea of collective or communal areas might seem like sort of Pollyanna, la-di-da, naivete, right? The idea that people will just be their best selves. But it speaks to the fact that capitalism hasn't always, or even capitalism as we think of it, I should really say industrial capitalism, as well as industrialized communism for that matter, those are relatively recent, whereas for a long, long time, communities have been getting together to manage resources and figure that out together, and some communities still do that, to voluntarily limit themselves or voluntarily arrange things. So it's an interesting pushback on the idea that we have to have a protected area or we have to have private land, which are two kinds of extremes I think that people can sometimes go to, thinking that those are the only two ways to conserve wildlife. Then again, it's worth noting that the examples they share, that I've shared, about half of them were examples where we didn't have a large market force in the area yet, and that indeed in some of those examples, like with fur trapping in southern Canada with Cree people, as market forces came into an area, it did increase pressure to do stronger amounts of harvesting. And so there's a lot of cultural forces at play, right? We can't think of this in isolation. We can't look at some case studies of sort of communal property, successful wildlife management and say, great, let's get rid of wildlife refuges, because a lot of the things that threaten wildlife in many areas are forces that are not sort of small-scale villages, right? These are large, multinational, potentially actors that are not going to necessarily listen to, the 10 people sitting around in the village tavern figuring out who's going to, catch lobsters in which part of the area. So it's not something, in other words, that can necessarily always scale up. But it is useful to think about. If nothing else, it reminds us that humans aren't just always greedy, selfish jerks who ruin everything. And it also might give us some indications of that even though we probably still need to always have protected areas, and I certainly really believe in them, maybe sometimes are rethinking what that looks like, right? There are areas where protected areas are really far from certain kinds of industrial forces, and would it make more sense for indigenous people to be sort of a main part of the management of those areas, as we've talked about before, things like that. So it kind of brings up to the idea of three different types of conservation we talk about. Top-down conservation, the idea of conservation from a government or something, you shall not hunt in this area. Bottom-up conservation, though, is a lot of what the Burke's reading is talking about. Bottom-up meaning sort of like people in the community, right? Ground swelling, ground up, grounded conservation. And then we also sometimes talk about middle-out conservation. That's not nearly as popular of a term, but Sherman uses it, the idea of sort of like the elites in a community helping to manage the situation or encourage more conservation. All right, well, at this point, I'd like to end all of this lecture, which has been a lot longer than I anticipated it to be. I apologize, by, saying how can we help? Because I think most of us want to. I think there's lots and lots and lots of answers to that. Most of us aren't poaching rhinos for ivory, so what is it we can do to help? We're also, most of us, not setting land policy, although we may vote on it occasionally. I put a few things that I think are helpful. One, if you zoo, support ethical zoos. I put or AZA certified zoos. Sometimes people can't research all the ins and outs of a specific zoo, but you can usually find out pretty quickly if a zoo is AZA certified, which usually means, one, they have some basic welfare standards for the animals, B, they have some basic medical standards and space standards for the animals' enclosures and care, and C, that they are typically involved in conservation programs, that the money is not solely going to profit the owners of the zoo, but also going into conservation. Shift towards less palm oil or sustainable palm oil. So, and I don't just mean palm oil, but other kinds of products that cause habitat loss in the wild. Understand the Endangered Species Act. That's really critical for those of us going into environmental work, that we really understand that. For people working for private industry too, that we really understand it and make sure that we are following it, both the letter and spirit of that law. Supporting Indigenous land tenure. So in a lot of areas, one of the greatest things that could be done is making sure that Indigenous people actually have property rights to an area they've sustainably hunted for a long time, so that it's not quickly bought up for less sustainable uses. Drive less, walk and bike and bus more. I wrote this slide I wrote when I was in North Texas, this part, so, and Alaska, it's often not feasible to not drive to where you're going. But, nonetheless, we can be thoughtful about how we drive, not just because of, climate change's impacts on species, although that's definitely a very real concern nowadays, especially as climate change makes certain refuges no longer as habitable for the species they were designed for, but also just because, on a practical, kind of more daily level, driving produces a lot of noxious fumes and different things that can negatively affect wildlife as well. And it also requires roads to be built, often through wildlife habitat. So being thoughtful about how we drive, right? Promoting habitat corridors. Here in Alaska, we have more of an opportunity to do that than a lot of people do. If you happen to own or rent a home, being thoughtful about, your lawn, maybe letting wildflowers grow in it, maybe letting wild trees grow in it, maybe not cutting down the trees that technically you own, but moose wander through, things like that. Maybe not always feasible, but I think a lot of us could do something and help there be habitat corridors. What a habitat corridor is when you have protected areas that are sort of where we think of as like, oh, that's where like the moose or the wolves or the bears can like hang out and build up their population. Well, moose is a bad example because they kind of go anywhere, at least down here. But a lot of species, we think of the refuges as kind of home base for them. It's like a game of tag. It's kind of a home base where they can be really safe. But a habitat corridor is the idea of let's have pieces of forest or whatever it is that connect these different protected areas that, even if they're very thin, might allow animals passageway between refuges, so that instead of having very small pockets of different populations of an endangered species or vulnerable species, that now we have interconnected pockets, which among other things means you'll have a much better genetic biodiversity, because let's say if we're looking at, it's hard because in Alaska we're so blessed with such rich wildlife. I'm trying to think of something that's endangered that we need to protect here that would need something like this. But let's talk about caribou. Caribou would actually be a really good example here on the Kenai Peninsula because we have far fewer caribou than we used to. Preserving a certain amount of those spaces so that caribou can get to their various different kind of safe zones, but have ways to get between them so they can be interbreeding and have healthier genetics. And then the final one that really applies to us, and I did write this part of the slide when I got here, hunt and fish thoughtfully and with respect, right? Um, Alaska has, I would say, pretty generous fishing laws if you're a resident. I make use of those. I enjoy dip netting. I'm sure a lot of you do as well. Be thoughtful. Take what you need. Don't take more. Or, some people are gifting to family members, and that's oftentimes a cultural practice as well. But, not just taking so much just to fill up a freezer that then you're going to not use and they're going to get freezer burned in 2 years, right? You take what you or the person you're gifting to will actually use, and do it with respect as well, right? Obviously, if you catch something that you didn't mean to catch and is something that you can get back into the wild or into the water viably, do so, right? Take the time to do so. And in my opinion, on an ethical level, if you're going to kill it fast. So anyways, it's enough soapboxing from your professor. I just kind of wanted to maybe give us some action steps so it wasn't just sort of, oh, everything's complicated, but some actual, action steps for helping with wildlife. Thank you very much for your time.